Hello, and welcome to the 2022 Ohioana Book Festival. I'm Hagan Faye Whiteleather, and I'm pleased to welcome you to this historical fiction panel. We'd like to thank our festival sponsors and partners, all of whom you can find listed on the Ohioana website. And thanks to our official bookseller, the Book Loft of German Village. You can get copies of all of the books featured at today's panel by going online to bookloft.com. And I'm now pleased to welcome our authors, Kinley Bryan, Barbara Kussow, Tracy Lawson, and Amelia Rosa. We'll begin by hearing a bit from each of you about the subject and history of your text, and we're going to open with Kinley Bryan. Kinley Bryan applied her love of writing to the world of corporate communications before her fascination with historical fiction became too great to ignore. Her debut novel, Sisters of Sweetwater Fury, was inspired by stories her great-grandfather, Walter Salker, who was at the helm of the four-mast schooner Golden Age, his wife Annabelle serving as ship's cook, when the storm hit. Kinley graduated summa cum laude from Kent State University with a degree in English and earned a master's degree in communications management from John Carroll University. Her love for the inland seas swelled during the years she spent in an old cottage on Lake Erie. She now lives with her husband and children on the Atlantic coast, where she prefers not to lose sight of the shore, which I love that. Kinley, please tell us a little bit about your work.
Okay. Well, first of all, thank you for having me. I'm really excited to be here at the Ohioana Book Festival. So this is my book, Sisters of the Sweetwater Fury. It's the story of three sisters who are caught in the Great Lakes storm of November 1913 and their struggle to survive this once-in-a-century storm. So if you hadn't heard of this storm, and I hadn't before I started researching this is a storm. It's been described as like the perfect storm for the Great Lakes. It was actually two different weather systems collided, and this storm lasted for 4 days. It had hurricane force winds upwards of 90 miles per hour, whiteout blizzard conditions, and waves that reached 35 feet, if you can imagine. So against that backdrop, this is also the story of the three women's struggles to exert some control over their own lives at a time when society's roles for women were pretty limited. So the three sisters are Sunny, Cordelia, and Agnes. Sunny is a galley cook working on the freight ship with her husband, Herb, who is the ship's steward. They've been doing this for 10 years, and Sunny has a dream to go ashore and open her own restaurant. She just has to work up the nerve to reveal this dream to her husband and convince him that this is something that they should do. First, she has got to survive this storm. Her sister, Cordelia, is also on the lakes when the storm hits. She has just married, perhaps rashly, a freighter captain, and she's joined him on this last trip up the lakes in November. And third, we have Agnes. She is on shore in the town of Port Austin, Michigan. She lives near the life-saving station. She is a widow of one of the lifesavers. She is at home chafing kind of at the life that she has with her mother, and she's dreaming of something more. And she's finding herself drawn to the sister of the life-saving station keeper. Her name is Lizzie. So each sister dreams of changing her life, and as the storm rages over those 4 days, they get a glimpse of clarity on how they might do that.
Oh, what a beautiful story. Oh, I can't wait to turn those pages. It's like right on the top of my to-read list right now. Thank you so much for sharing, Kinley. Barbara Kussow is the author of a novel, Portrait of Annie, and two novellas, The Spencers of Ohio, an Abolitionist Family in the Civil War Era, and Merlin Subsidiary. She is a contributor to Writing After Retirement. Her poetry and short stories have been published in several print and online venues. She edited and publishes Still Crazy, a literary magazine that publishes works written by and or about people over the age of 50. She did that from 2008 until 2017. Barbara's education includes a BS and an MEd in English education at the University of Missouri, Columbia, and an MLS from Kent State University. It's nice to see yet another Kent State alum.
Thank you.
I'm a Kent State alum myself, so please share with us your writing, Barbara.
Okay, thank you. Nice to be here. Portrait of Annie follows the life of a woman for 30-some years. And she was born in rural Ohio, and the novel begins in 1961. And she went to a small rural high school. She has a scholarship based on her artistic abilities, but she's feeling very uneasy about her being in a large university. So the first part of the novel really covers her life in the 60s at OSU. And of course, as we all know, the 60s was a turbulent decade, and it was dominated by the Vietnam War protest and political assassinations, the rise of the counterculture, what else? Student unrest. And OSU was maybe could be considered a microcosm of student unrest throughout the country. There were different factions that was kind of a toxic stew. The women were advocating for more rights. Black students were advocating for better representation and maybe changes in the curriculum. Freedom of speech people were rebelling against restrictive policies by the administration. They wanted to have certain speakers in, and the administration said no because they were communist or had communist leanings or socialist leanings or whatever. And then, of course, there was the anti-war demonstrations, particularly against the ROTC. And you throw into the mix counterculture and drugs, and it was just, as I say, a kind of toxic stew. So Annie watches all of this, she observes all of this, and she develops entanglements with a graduate student and a charismatic poet, spoiler, who is involved in counterculture activities. She's not a hippie herself, but she's just kind of an observer and a passive participant in a way. But the unrest at OSU approaches anarchy as the decade ends. I mean, there were tear gas and billy clubs, and the Ohio National Guard came in to quell the disruption. And finally, it culminated in the university being closed for 2 weeks. And actually, they were afraid that what happened at Kent State, the shootings, would happen at OSU. And that was part of the reason for the closure. So she goes to the infamous 1969 Woodstock Festival, and she participates in the March on Washington against the Vietnam War. At the end of the decade, she makes a decision to use her artistic abilities to do portraits, portraiture, which is where the title of the novel comes from, Portrait of Annie. Then she embarks on a more stable existence, but she's yet to be rocked by personal difficulties and tragedies. So the last half of the book really is post-60, and so I'm not sure you could call it a 60s novel, although I'm sure some people will. And that's about it.
Thank you so much, Barbara. My Aunt Shirley actually was there during the Kent State shooting, and she witnessed it from a building that she was standing in. And she's been kind of ruminating on that time period quite a bit. So I think the portrait of Annie would be a perfect book present for me to give her sometime very
great.
soon. So thank you for sharing.
I have to say that maybe this was foolish of me to write a book about OSU in the 60s when I didn't actually go to OSU myself. It was just something that interested me and I did research on. And
well, that's the job of a novelist, right? To imagine,
yeah.
to put yourself somewhere else, to put your characters in an environment that is part fact, part creation. And I'm glad that you did.
Okay.
Thank you so much, Laura. We will move on to Tracy Lawson. So Tracy's passion for storytelling led her first into the world of dance and educational theater, and enjoyed a career as a dance teacher, studio owner, and choreographer that has spanned nearly 3 decades. A midlife career change has yielded 6 books, a 4-volume series of thrillers for young adults, and 2 nonfiction history books based on the lives of her pioneer ancestors. While her body of work may seem varied, the common thread that connects all her books is her character's pursuit of individual liberty. Tracy, who's married with 1 grown daughter and 2 spoiled cats, splits her time between Dallas, Texas, and Columbus, Ohio. We're glad to have you in Ohio, either virtually or physically, Tracy. So please tell us a bit about your writing.
Thank you. I'm actually home in Dallas right now. I was in Ohio last weekend for our daughter's wedding and just came home on Monday. So I'm still trying to figure out what day of the week it is. And I'm glad to be here. I'm glad I showed up on the right day. My book is based on a family tale. Answering Liberty's Call stars my 6 times great-grandparents. And the family story was handed down through the generations. I discovered it in 2013 when I was working on a 50th anniversary gift from my parents. And I thought I would do Who Do You Think You Are for them, because my mom's favorite TV show is the show where they do the genealogy on celebrities. So I was running out all the different stories I could find, and I came across this story of a female patriot. Now, according to the story, which, it's steeped in legend and we can't be sure, we can't substantiate all the details, but the story that's come down through the ages is Anna's husband was a Baptist minister who enlisted to fight the British, and he and her brothers left for Valley Forge, leaving her with relatives. So when she heard of the privations there, she said, I can't just sit at home and do nothing. I've got to go to them. And so she packed what she could carry on her saddle horse and set off for the army camp, which was 200 miles away. So about a week and a half on horseback. So she sets off, never having been out of Virginia before, with nothing but a crude map to guide her. And, of course, she gets into all kinds of scrapes along the way. And when she gets to York, Pennsylvania, where the Continental Congress is spending the winter, one of the congressmen there, who's an ally of Washington, pulls her aside and he says, hey, you're headed for Valley Forge. I've got this message that has got to get to the commander-in-chief, and all my regular couriers are being watched. No one will suspect a woman of doing anything important, so will you carry it to the general and put it in his hands? And so, of course, she worries that if the camp is thrown into disarray, if there's a mutiny, or if the British attack while her husband and brothers are there, she could end up having even more trouble. So she says, of course, I'll carry the message. The next morning she sets off, and it's not an hour before a man rides up and blocks her way and says, that congressman changed his mind and he wants that message back, so you can just hand it over. And that moment she had to decide, do I believe him or do I run for it? And the rest of the story is the rest of the story. So I had so much fun digging in and researching and learning about my family, learning about not just Anna and Benjamin, but about their relatives, their brothers and sisters, their parents, their children, and putting together a story that brought the 2 main questions that I had was, A, why would she do this ridiculous thing? Because it was absolute folly to leave during the wintertime, unknown situation. And, you couldn't call ahead and say, hey, I'm on my way. And if you disappear on the way, no one's going to know what happened to you. She left 3 little children at home. And, it had to have been a desperate decision on her part. And so why would she make that decision? Well, I learned the answer to that question through my genealogical research, and I'm not going to tell what it is. You'll have to read the book to find out. And then the second question was, what was in that message to General Washington and what was so important? So that was really fun. It took about 3 years of research, and the book just came out in a second edition with a brand new cover that I designed myself and took part in the photo shoot. We had such a great time shooting down here in Texas in January. It wasn't super cold, but the trees were bare, so we got the winter look. But I just have had so much fun putting together this story that I've turned it into a series, the Ladies of the Revolution series. And the second book will star another revolutionary lady that you may never have heard of, who made a great contribution to the fight for independence.
Excellent. Oh, what a beautiful story and a beautiful gift for not only your parents, but for all your readers.
Oh my gosh, and all the cousins I had no idea I had have just come out of the woodwork, because Anna and Benjamin eventually had 11 children. So if you have the last name Stone and you live in Ohio, Indiana, Kentucky, Illinois, or Michigan, we're probably cousins. So it was just really super fun to do all that research and meet so many new cousins.
Isn't that the beauty of genealogical research, where you just have all of these new family members like come into the fold? It's lovely. Thank you so much. And last but certainly not least, we have Amelia Rosa, who was raised in Brazil. During her childhood, she lived in Rio de Janeiro, where every sunny weekend was generally spent at the beach. Having moved to south of Brazil, she holds fond memories of summer vacations spent with her married sister in Rio, who also involved many hours at the beach. Her love for the sea in Rio de Janeiro was, as well as the city's history, permeates the pages of her first fiction book, Finding Christina. During her teens, she avidly read in Portuguese, Spanish, English, French, and Italian. A few years ago, she developed a love for murder mysteries written during the golden age of detective fiction. Amelia moved back to the United States several years ago. She has published poetry and is writing a sequel to Finding Christina. Her readers can contact her via Facebook, Instagram, Goodreads at Amelia Rosa Author, and Twitter at Amelia U Rosa 1. We're so excited to talk about your latest work. Please tell us, how did you feel about writing this beautiful new novel?
Well, this is my first fiction. I used to write poetry. I hope you can see this is the cover of the book that is on the back too. Everything was homemade. This was independently published. And my husband actually constructed the cover with pictures I gave him. I thought it was interesting that it was Barbara who mentioned imagining things, and I think that's exactly what fiction is. You imagine lots of things. At least I see a movie in my mind when I'm writing something. The scene just develops like a movie, and it's something that it's very gratifying when people come to me and say, your imagery is so real that I see everything. Also helps a little bit the fact that I lived in Rio and I know the town, and many of the buildings that appear in the story are still there. The story, as the title of the book says, is Finding Christina, and she's actually right there, the first scene. So it's kind of strange that it's Finding Christina when she's the first one to appear in the story. But it's not exactly her. It's a mystery that exists in her past. She doesn't know. You have a little hint of it when you read the first chapter, that she approaches her mother and they are talking. And the mother, when she leaves, thinks how wonderful it would be if her father had accepted her. So you wonder, is she illegitimate? What is the problem? What happened in her past? The time frame is 1924. And I imagine how wonderful Rio was at the time, because I collected many pictures of the city at that time. There is this handsome American who comes to Rio searching for Christina, looking for her. He is in the background. He is, well, I already said he's from the United States. He is in a yacht, which is very convenient because he has several friends with him and they are all a little bit crazy. So there's mystery, romance, of course, with this handsome guy, obviously, and a lot of funny moments that I hope people would think funny. I had fun when I wrote them. I'm not really sure what I can say because I don't want to give away the plot. the story is, there is no negative things. I don't like dark mysteries. So it's a light movie. I'm sorry, book. I imagine it's a movie in the future. I would hope it terribly, because Rio is such a beautifully photogenic town. I remember always wondering, enjoying when I was driving around the town. But anyway, I guess that's it. I'm not really sure what else I can tell you about it. You have to read it.
Well, you've given us an enticing description, definitely. Any story that has a lot of fun to it, I think, is always a nice breath, especially in a time of a lot of global unrest. It's kind of lovely to find a beautiful story within the pages. So thank you for sharing with us. So we're going to move on to questions. If you'd like, we can move from person to person like we did introducing your text, or if you want to jump in, intersect, add a little bit of commentary to somebody's response. So we have about 35 minutes left, so here we go. So I want to focus on the historical elements of your work, since this is a historical fiction panel. So how is the past influencing your present creation? Why do you think these stories from long ago, or relatively not that long ago, are relevant for today? What can a modern reader learn from exploring the past and from these past movements, events, like little pieces of history? So if we would like, we could go Kinley, Barbara, Tracy, Emilia, or we can jump all around, whatever you feel most comfortable with.
I think that people are always the same. If you analyze the reactions, although they talk differently, they dress differently, you start researching history and you realize that we have always been the same. The surroundings change, a few habits, a few moral codes, but we're all the same. At least I think. I don't find any big differences. Obviously, the Moors were completely different. 1924, Christina was considered a little bit avant-garde because she worked, she cut her hair. That's what women were doing at that time.
I agree with Emilia, because my story set in the 1770s, but people generally worried about the same things they worry about now. They worried about a pandemic. They worried about women and children's health. They worried about government corruption. They worried about all kinds of things that now we're like, well, think this is new. This is something to worry about. No, let me just tell you, honey, this was all happening, 250 years ago. And then I think also young women who say, oh, women's rights, it's just terrible. Well, let me take you back to the 1700s and talk about a time when, women had no rights at all, and see just how far we've been able to come in a very short span of time when you consider the breadth of all of history, how many strides we've made in just such a short period of time.
And sometimes seeing that contrast can be mobilizing, inspiring, right? To call for further action, further change. Excellent. Kinley or Barbara?
I would say there's similar themes in my novel with the women and the societal expectations of them at the time. And then I just think there's always a perennial interest in ships and shipwrecks and maritime accidents, whether it's the Titanic or reading about the giant container ships that got stuck in the Suez Canal last year. So that's something. I like the way one reviewer put it online. They said, you can enjoy this historical fiction on many levels, learning about the ships and their crews, following the path of the storm in days before instant communication, and wrapping yourself in the dreams of young women as they navigate the realities of their times. So there's really a few different levels that you could enjoy the story on. And I would say that was one thing that was really stood out to me is the things that were different with shipping back then, things that we would take for granted as being a good idea, like, radio telephone communication. That was all, the wireless telephone was very new. And a lot of captains didn't really want that at the time. They didn't want to be able to be called up at any time by their shipping bosses. They liked the independence of being out on the lakes for days and weeks at a time. So it's just fun to see the contrast.
And I love that this is a panel full of strong female protagonists. That's always very exciting to see. But too, like there is some kind of universal draw, I think, that human beings have towards water, towards the ocean, towards like the sea. There is some kind of beautiful connectivity to that. I think all of you have kind of mentioned that there's a timelessness to these stories. And I think that's true, especially when we read fiction from 200 or 300 or 500 years ago that still somehow connects with readers today. Very nice. Barbara.
Well, the 60s are still so much with us, and we still reference them so often that, I mean, it didn't even seem like historical fiction when I was writing it, but it was one of the most tumultuous and divisive periods in history. And now we're living through another tumultuous and divisive period. And I think the roots of some of our current problems started, and maybe in the 60s, or at least came to a head in the 60s. Mm-hmm.
Definitely. So, and that can be an inspiring piece as well, right? To teach another young generation to be youth in revolt, right? To strive for higher moralistic and social ideals. Mm-hmm. Very exciting. So with diving into the past in mind, I'd like to know, what was your research process like? Did you have a concept and then seek out information to flesh it out? Or did you find inspiration reading about these issues or eras, kind of like Tracy did, like, oh, there's this spark. So what was the process like for you?
I'll go first since you just said my name. I started off with learning of the story on Ancestry.com. The first thing I did was get in touch with the president of the DAR chapter, the Daughters of the American Revolution chapter, that's named in my grandmother's honor, and asked what research they had, and went from there and just branched out. But it was learning about not only Anna and her family, but also about what day-to-day life was like in the 1700s, so that I could write knowledgeably about it. And then also delving into the political situation, because we all had our survey of American history classes. We were raised in the US. And we know the bare bones, and we know the dates, but we don't know everything that was going on behind the scenes. We don't know that at any given time, a third of the American population was in favor of the war, a third was not, and a third was ambivalent. And those numbers kept changing, and people kept changing alliances. And so it's very interesting to look at it from a woman's perspective, a woman not only who's on the home front, but who goes into the action, and then also look at some of the other outerlying issues that were very important at the time, but we don't always get to in our survey of US history classes.
Excellent.
I knew that I'm sorry.
No, go ahead.
No, you go right ahead.
I knew that I wanted to have the Copacabana Palace Hotel in the story. And it was inaugurated in 1924. And I always loved the past. Since I was a girl, my biggest passion is ancient Egypt, that I fell in love when I was a little girl. But I always loved the past, anything from the past. And so that's one of the reasons that I chose 1924, because then I could put the building that is magnificent, is really beautiful. I do not have a method, and I think that my method is not have a method. I just find books, read them, make notes, research the internet with a grain of salt, because you never know exactly what source they're using. And I think also the 1920s was because of my favorite writers like Agatha Christie and Dorothy L. Sayers. I'm a little less known than Agatha Christie. She created Lord Peter Wimsey. Mm-hmm. And her mysteries were, you probably know, the mysteries were also fun. So it's all kind of chained together. I do not have a method. I have my notes for the next novel that I'm writing, the sequel to Finding Christina, and I have about 50 or 60 little notes, pieces of all kinds of paper you can imagine, napkins that I write when it just pops out of my mind. I imagine that most people are like that. I don't know.
I think it is a mark of a true author that you have scraps of napkin and little backs of receipts and ripped fly leaves out of books, because you get the idea right then. And if you don't jot it down, it could just ephemerally dissolve into nothing.
Yes. I normally have a good excellent idea of the scene because I see it, but sometimes there's something in the scene that just I have to write. I don't forget the scene, which is kind of strange because my memory is a little crazy lately.
Well, that's true, I think, of a writer too. You get lost in your own world. It kind of makes everything else a little fuzzy.
Mhm.
Great. So Tracy's kind of basing hers off a concept. Amelia's basing hers off the image of this historic location. I love to see how these seeds are planted. Kinley or Barbara?
Yeah, go ahead, Barbara.
I'm so sorry.
Sorry. Well, the seeds for this novel were actually sown at a different university in 1968, I guess it was, when I was a student there. And someone mentioned a scene, and I still remember maybe a sit-in, was a demonstration, but a quiet demonstration with sort of clumps of people in their colorful hippie garb, their tie-dyes and bell-bottoms and everything, sitting around on the oval. And I was working in the geology department as I was a part-time student helper, and you could look out and see this scene on the lawn. And I remember a graduate student came in and he started criticizing them. And I said, but they're just quiet. They're not, they're not disrupting anything. And I was more tolerant than he was. But anyway, then I moved to Ohio, and I discovered or became more aware of the history of the riots at OSU. And first I thought about putting my novel as a fictional university, but then I said, why not use OSU? So, and there's just tons of information. William Shakurty's book, the Ohio State University in the 60s is a very good source. I used newspapers, accounts of the Columbus Dispatch, the Ohio State Journal, and books. There's lots of books about the Woodstock Festival at the library, and online sources. And I was a former reference librarian, so I really dig research.
So you have experience in digging. I love that.
Yeah.
Excellent. Kinley.
Oh yeah, well, so as you mentioned in my bio, the spark for this story came from a bit of family history that I learned about from my father a few years ago. I knew that I had a number of Great Lakes captains in my ancestry. And it was just a few years ago, though, that I learned that my great-grandfather and his wife were actually caught in this storm. And I'd never heard of this storm until this point. They were not on the steel freighters, which are featured in my book. They were on a four-masted schooner, and they survived the storm. They sheltered on Beaver Island in Lake Michigan for several days until the storm blew itself out. And the family story goes that my great-grandmother, Annabelle, told my great-grandfather, Walter, that if they survived this storm, this was it. She was done with sailing after that. And so they survived, and he kept his promise. They went ashore, and he managed a fishing company after that. But the more I thought about this storm and researched it, I was just fascinated, and I just wanted to know, what must it have been like to be out there? But yeah, I wanted to do it from a female perspective, just because you don't see that as much, in the history books. And so I just read, there are a number of great nonfiction accounts of the storm that include contemporary newspaper reports and even firsthand accounts from the actual sailors, the ones that survived. I mean, I will say that this storm sank 12 of those great steel freighters, like 12. I mean, it was really incredible. And then I also found a great nonfiction book called Wreck Ashore by Frederick Stonehouse, and it's about the U.S. Life-Saving Service, because that also features prominently in the book. This was, of course, the precursor to the U.S. Coast Guard, which was founded in 1915, so 2 years after this storm. And I just found that whole thing fascinating, learning about the life-saving service.
Excellent. And your research really ties us into our next question, which is, how do you establish the voice of your characters in these time periods? Now, it's perhaps a little easier if you live through it like Barbara, like if you've seen it, if you've experienced it, if you've heard that dialect in your own ears. But were you reading a lot of firsthand accounts of diary entries, or were you kind of crafting these voices of your own imagination? Kinley seems to have gone that's the route I go as well. Whenever I'm writing historical fiction, I dive into text of the time period, not text about the time period, so to speak. So who would like to share? How did you develop these voices?
If I may, since nobody started, I actually read a lot of books of that period because I like old books.
Mm-hmm.
I'm now in trouble because there are 3 books here that I really want to read, and they are all modern. But I noticed certain difference in people didn't use cursing, and I'm not sure if I'm using the correct word in English. For God's sake, it was something that there was a little, empty space because they wouldn't put that in a book. So I got my inspiration exactly from the books that I read. And also I did a lot of research with slang. I love languages. I studied linguistics when I was in Brazil in college. I didn't finish, but I got very close to finishing. And I am fascinated by words. So I used some of the slang, very little, because I was afraid it was going to get boring. As I am an enthusiast with words, I had to be very careful how much I would put so people wouldn't get like, my goodness, I have to go to the references all the time. So that's basically how I did it.
Oh, I love that. I'm sure everyone in here is a lover of words to an extensive degree, but I am impressed with how many languages you read in. Oh my goodness.
Because I studied when I was a kid. Yeah, I had it in school.
Yeah, I agree with Emilia. To get the voice of a character from another time period, you've got to, I read a lot of contemporary things that were available in the Library of Congress. I read a lot of letters that soldiers had written home from Valley Forge so that I would get the construction of a letter, so that when her husband wrote her letters, I would see how the salutation was formal and what kind of things he would say. And, they always seem to say things like, oh, thank you so much for the pair of gloves. My old ones were worn through. And then they would, talk about other people in camp. And then they would finish with, I pray for you every day and I can't wait to come home and see you and the children, please write soon and tell me about the children. So, just the kind of things that husbands and wives would write together in formal, correspondence, but also, documents that were left over from the famous people that we know of. But it was more important to delve into the everyday to get the meter of the speech right. Now, I did watch some television series that are set in the time period just to kind of try and get the meter of the speech. But then, like Emilia, once I got all the slang and all the 1770s ease, I pared it down so that it was easier to read. So it had the flavor, but it wasn't necessarily, everything nay and yay. And you wanted to just make it so that it's easy to read and people feel like they're in the space. Because if we went back to the 1770s, we would understand pretty much everything they had to say, except for the slang. We might be a little confused, but other than that, it would be very easy to communicate.
Just a slightly diluted dialect. I like that.
Yes. Yeah, and they did not have the British accent that we think of as the common British accent. They used a rhotic R. So our accent now is much more like what Americans would have used in the 1770s. The upper class British accent developed later. So it's very interesting when you think about it, that they would have sounded pretty much like us. They wouldn't have had a Southern accent or a British accent. They would have sounded like we do in the Midwest.
Oh, very interesting. I didn't know that. Barbara?
Okay, well, my protagonist is a person I can identify with, but she's not me. As I said, I didn't go to Ohio State. I didn't go to Woodstock. I didn't have an affair with a poet. I'm not an artist. But having said all that, she shares some of my sensibilities. So, you know, it was an easy choice, I guess.
A familiar voice.
Mhm.
Kinley?
Yeah, and I read, like I mentioned, the contemporary accounts of the time. I found a great book written and published in 1909 by James Oliver Curwood, and it was about his trip across or up the Great Lakes. He was a passenger on one of these straight deck freighters that feature in my novel. So it was great to get his, because he was not a sailor, he was a writer, and so to get his perspective on things, that helped me a lot. Yeah, and just to hear the lingo and everything, he was really descriptive, and also like what the shoreline looked like at the time, and the features of the freighter as well, just reinforce that.
So I have a few more specific writing process questions, and then we'll kind of shift gears into inspiration as well as inspiring other writers who are perhaps interested in delving into this genre. But first, did you take any liberties with your work or your time period, or were you super detail oriented? Like, I would like to know what a bottle of Coke looked like in this particular deck, or conversely, if Coke had not yet been invented. So how did you feel? Like, did you find like hyper specific details, or were you more immersed in the story and the interactions between characters?
I am very, very much in just like that. I did my detail goes so far that I even made clothes for myself that I'm using in presentations and book signings. Even the underwear, I'm working on the bra, but I have the slip already that is exactly the way they wore then. It gives you actually a very good idea. I mean, you don't have to do that for a book, but it gives you a very good idea. How people dressed has a lot to do with the Moors at the time. It's very, very significant. Only one character I took a little liberty, because capoeira is that martial art the blacks in Brazil brought from Africa. One of the people that I mentioned, macaco, which actually means monkey in English, they took these sobriquets because it was illegal at that time. You could not play capoeira because it was illegal. And he died in 1912, I believe. So he would be dead by the time the story. So I stretched a little bit to make him alive long enough to teach the other capoeira guy who has a part in the story. It's a small part, but I am very, very detail oriented. Actually, most of the details that I researched, I didn't really use because it was a bit too much. Everything you can imagine.
Yeah.
I think it's important to have all that behind you, the background, so that it fleshes out the story in your own mind movie, even if it doesn't quite all make it onto the page.
Yeah.
Tracy?
Yes, it's true. I was laughing because Emilia, I did the same thing. I created my character's wedding ensemble from 1767 and did it all by hand, no sewing machine, because we wouldn't have had sewing machines at the time. And so, but it was the same kind of thing. You want to delve in and you want to know everything about it. Now, I took some liberties with what went on behind closed doors in Congress. But I had done enough research and read enough of the historians that specialize in that period to get a good idea of what was going on. I don't know exactly who the movers and shakers were, but I have a pretty good idea, because both of the written accounts of this story say that it was William Henry Harrison who confronted Anna and said, "Will you carry the message?" Well, William Henry Harrison was a toddler at the time. He was our 9th president. And he was an Ohio guy. So of course, growing up in Ohio, I was like, no, that's Tippecanoe and Tyler too. That's not, it was his father, Benjamin Harrison, who was a member of the House of Burgesses and then a signer of the Declaration and a member of Congress. And he was just coming out of his term as the events were taking place. And I thought, okay, I set him up to say, I was supposed to go home for Christmas, but I couldn't leave because we had stuff going on here. I had to take care of this. And so put him in charge of, because his roommates in York, Pennsylvania, when they fled Philadelphia, they're crammed into rooming houses and private homes. 6 or 7 of his roommates were the chief members of the Conway cabal who wanted to get rid of Washington. And I thought, oh, how fortuitous is that he could listen at doors and listen and hear what was going on. So of course he had to be the guy who was linked to the conspiracy. But you have to kind of put your character in places where they may not have been so they can narrate the story. Because if you only have one narrator, you've got to drop them in to hear, Lafayette's toast or hear what Harrison was saying at this particular time. So that's the fun of it, is finding out all the facts so that you can just like sneak your character into the background and have them witness these events in history.
Puzzle piece the timeline together.
Absolutely, absolutely.
I was really detail oriented. I really wanted to get the exact course and chronology of the storm and the details about the ships. That said, all the characters are made up in my book. And the 2 freighters that feature prominently, one is very closely modeled after a real life freighter and what happened to it. The other is kind of based on an amalgamation of a couple different freighters. But yeah, all the characters are made up. There was a real life husband and wife, steward and cook team on one of the freighters that was kind of the inspiration for Sunny and Herb. But for the most part, characters all made up, but I tried to get the other details pretty exact.
Did you go out on the water in the process of writing?
I did not, no. But I did, I used to live on Lake Erie. And so I used my memories of that time when I was writing Agnes's scenes, because she's right on the shore of Lake Huron. So remembering the wind and the smells and the way the lake changes, especially in the fall.
Sometimes those youthful memories can be even stronger and more powerful than the ones that we create as adults. So
That's for sure.
Love that. Barbara.
Liberties. I'm not quite sure what is meant by liberties, but to a limited extent, there were some real life characters who interacted with my fictional characters. But for the most part, I guess I'm more interested in the narrative. I tried to be scrupulous in representing the details of what was going on with historical events and what was going on at OSU during the time period. So,
well, as a librarian, I'm sure your research is rock solid, Lisa, as a lived experience.
Well, here's hoping.
I have faith in you. So I have 2 more questions for you all. So one deals with that intuition, that author's sense. How did you know? Like, did you feel something click in your mind? Was it, as Emilia said, like this movie just popped before your brain that this was the story you needed to tell? Did you have some sort of intuition or sense like that this book was inside of you before it came to be?
I think it was inside of me. That's what my husband keeps telling me. I started a book many, many years ago. It was Rio to 1800s, and I gave up because it was really too caught up with the research that I love reading. I don't know where this story came from. It was somewhere. I have no idea. It just came up to me. I start writing, and then things, I didn't have a plan of who was going to do what. I knew the basic characters for obvious reasons, otherwise you don't have a story. And the rest just comes to you. It's so fun. It's almost like real humans who suddenly show up and say, hey, I'm here, and this is what I do. It's very odd because coming from poetry, it's completely different. Poetry is 100%, at least for me, 100% feeling. I'm turning inside out when I write poetry. And fiction is, I use a little bit of this, especially if you read the opening of the book. And people actually notice that. Sometimes you have so many poetic things, it's so different. But I have no idea where Christina came from. She just popped up.
Just like knocking on the mental door.
Yeah, she was there.
Now with Anna, of course, I told you that I found the story on ancestry.com, but I put it aside because I was in the middle of another series at the time. Now I had written nonfiction history and I had written thrillers. And so when I had finished my series and we were driving to visit friends, we were listening to a podcast and the host said, we rarely see history from a woman's point of view. And I thought, golly, I'm a writer, I should do something about that. And so as I thought, well, what should I, how can I, and Anna's story popped into my brain and I pulled my pen and notebook out of my purse and I was writing pages of notes before we got where we were going. And from that moment forward, Anna's voice was in my head. I would hear them talking and I would just write down what they said and then figure it out later. But that's how they kind of spill to me first. But I always heard her voice and she became more and more interesting as I learned about her. And then her husband, I thought, well, how can I make this like country Baptist preacher interesting? But I found out that he was actually on the forefront of a movement to gain freedom of religion before it was part of what we had in our country. Mm-hmm. And he and the outlaw Baptist preachers of the 1750s, 60s, and 70s were very influential in framing the Constitution and the Bill of Rights. And so that made him that much more exciting. So the more I learned about them, the cooler they got. And they became a 1700s power couple. So
that's amazing. I find it so fascinating how these characters just kind of bloom and then you overhear these conversations in your mind, almost as if you're eavesdropping, even though it's your own creation.
Totally.
The writer's brain is a very tangled thing.
For me, it helps to have a personal connection, either a place that I've been or a family story. And I end up, thinking about the concept for a long time before I start writing. And if the concept doesn't go away, then I know I'm usually onto something. And then sometimes it's a physical feeling too, like a fluttery feeling, like I'm so excited to write this, which I think is really important because you end up spending so much time, with this idea and writing that it helps to have that to keep you going.
That's what I usually tell my students. If you're not so excited and bursting over to put your thoughts onto the page or to tell somebody your next scene, then maybe it's not something that you can sustain for a long project. But if you have that butterfly feeling, then there's definitely something there. Barbara.
Okay, I think I got ahead of myself and I mentioned the scene that sort of stayed with me from the University of Missouri about the people demonstrating on the Oval. But another story there is that I used to hang out at a coffee house there near the geology department where I worked. And it was a quiet place where you could go and have a cup of coffee and study between classes or so on. And then suddenly the hippies came in and took over and it became a less pleasant place. And I watched as some of the students who had seemed normal became kind of zombies. I think they were strung out on drugs. And I know at least one of my characters in the novel is sort of modeled after maybe a guy that I didn't know, but I saw there. So yeah, I don't know. I've kind of forgotten what the question was, but anyway.
Oh, it's just that feeling of how you're going to write something. That image.
It just sort of stays with you, certain scenes, and you can't quite get rid of them in your head. And
putting them on the page kind of makes them larger and takes them out of your own skull. I like that.
Mm-hmm.
Well, we are almost out of time, I'm sad to say, but I have one final question for you all, which I think our viewers would be really interested in your answers. Do you have any points of wisdom or writing advice for aspiring writers in the historical fiction genre or just writing in general, especially those of you that dabble in multi-genre?
I think that the best thing to do is to sit down and write. That's my advice. If you want to write a historical, and this is my first book, who am I to keep giving advice to people? But just do your research, know your story. Know your history very well. Or if you don't have a good memory, write everything down. Make sure you have the research that you used clearly stated, which I didn't do in the first book. And people ask me where I got the information. Sometimes I remember and sometimes I don't remember. But And right. Did I say right?
Well, I think advice from a first-time novelist is especially important for aspiring writers because you are where they would be if they accomplished the amazing thing that you did by completing a novel. So thank you. Yes, writing, that's definitely number one. Tracy?
Don't make my
Yes.
mistake. Write it down.
Yep. My thought is rely on your second draft. Don't try to get everything into your first draft. Overlearn and then write your first draft. And then when you go back, figure out how to drop in those informational little gems that will put you in your scene organically. Instead of whacking people over the head with, yes, we're in 1778. You need to just give the scene. The advice I was given is 3 details make a scene. And so I think that if you can do that, do it in your second draft when you already know what's going to happen. And then you can go back and you can add those little details that make it feel like it's in the right setting.
Right, press through, craft it, and then
press through, tell the story, and then make it beautiful. Yes.
Excellent. Kinley?
I like that because I think I end up putting a lot of details in when I'm first writing it because I'm like, oh, I done all this great research. I know all this stuff about freighters. Let me tell you about the triple expansion steam engine, That's not in there. No, don't worry. But knowing what to take out or having somebody read it. My husband was really helpful in this way. He read the manuscript a couple of times, and when I would get a little too much detail, he'd write in the margins, now you're just showing off. Like, okay, you're right, I'll take that out. So that would be my advice.
Knowing where to erase is definitely good advice. Barbara?
She stole what I was going to say. Yeah, the reader is more interested in the narrative, and if you include too many details, you're reading nonfiction or you're boring your reader. But another thing, it's disappeared from my mind, so I'll just leave it at that.
If it comes back, let us know, but reiteration is so important. So even if you have the same point, I think we as writers sometimes need to hear good advice more than once. Otherwise, we would be perfect out of the gate.
Well, one thing is to have some good readers, beta readers who will point out your mistakes, especially your historical mistakes. I have a friend who is very good at that. And yeah.
It's very important to find readers that will be critical. That's one of the most helpful parts of the process, right? Is people not afraid to tell us where we need to be stronger. Amelia.
I may add something, and maybe, I don't know if it's because English is not my mother tongue, but I reread that manuscript 100 times. I go back and reread all the time. I don't know if it's the practice that people have as writers, but it helped me a lot.
And read out loud. Read your dialogue out loud so it sounds natural. Because if you can't say it, they can't say it.
Sure.
That I'll double down on that advice. That's what I tell my students. No matter what I'm teaching, be it creative writing or critical writing, always read your work aloud, and you'll catch the mistakes that you wouldn't have caught if you were just reading it with your eyes. Any final words of wisdom you'd like to share with our audience? Well, I am bummed to say that our hour has elapsed. I've so enjoyed our conversation and your incredible insights into the writing process. Personally, I feel really invigorated to take to the keys after everything you've all shared. It's very inspiring. But my deep appreciation goes to Kinley, Barbara, Tracy, Emilia. Thank you for sharing your voices and your written words. I look forward to seeing even more of your books on the shelves in the future. And as a reminder, you can get copies of the books by each one of our authors from the Book Loft at German Village at bookloft.com. And thanks again to our festival sponsors and partners. And thank you for joining us. And please check out the Ohioana website for all of this year's festival programming. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.